Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton, and this is Family Life in the North Country. To start with, here's a question. Does can a counselor work with couples when they've already separated? Is there any hope for reconciliation? And the answer, yes, it can. In fact, when I started doing marriage and family counseling, working with couples had just started. Before that, all the counseling was done with individuals. And so what would happen, people would work with individuals and try to get them to come to some kind of adjustment. Now it's much easier with the techniques we have of working with the couples together. Even though they've been separated, they don't, of course, have to go back together. It's easier if they do. I mean, to live together while they are being counseled. But it can be done, and it's quicker and faster to work with a couple instead of individuals. Well, here's another one. In the book, and came in from somebody who apparently is a reader, said in the book Slouching Toward Gomorrah by Judge Robert Bork, he says a lot of things I've heard you say. He's talking about me, so that was a surprise. But the party said, what are the remedies? What can be done about some of these things? Well, first, thanks for the compliment. I've read some of Judge Bork. I haven't read that book, but some of his others. The remedies for some of these problems are serious because the problems are interlocking. They didn't just suddenly jump up. If you try to correct one problem, you may cause another one. And that's sort of the problem about so many of these things in society today. We have a system of society. Our society runs on like a system, like a mobile. We've all seen these little things hanging up, the wind blows them and they in movement. Well, if you take any one of those little pieces off the mobile, it's out of balance. Well, our society is sort of that way too. If we start trying to manage one part of our society, we're going to have an impact on other parts. And when we get into trying to correct things, so often there is no overall plan or pattern in our legislation. Somebody who may be pure gold as far as intentions goes wants to put in a bill to correct something. But that same person may not have a sufficient view of what society is to really know how his corrective action is going to have an impact on somebody else's. Well, this became quite evident in things like the environment. Every kind of legislation today practically has to have an environmental impact statement attached to it before it's passed. Well, I think the same thing ought to happen in family life. I think before all kinds of legislation takes place, we ought to have an impact statement. What is this going to do to the family? For example, if you were to try to correct something in the environment very strongly, it may indeed have an impact on the people. If somebody comes along and says we have too many people and you start trying to control population, it's going to have an impact on family. We get into all of these things now for a number of, it turns out to be years, hasn't it, on this program. I've mentioned that there are 6 basic requirements in society. All of them are necessary, and if we tamper with one, we have to make sure it doesn't deny the fulfillment of another one. For example, the biological necessities. Just sensible, isn't it? Every society has to have one, have a pattern of biological necessities. But every society, in order to survive, also has to have reproduction. It has to be able to replace itself, or to acquire new people for the society in some other way. Then you have to teach people in the society how to take their places. You have to have production, distribution of goods and services, discipline and order, a motivation for survival. All of these things are involved. And I think we have to keep in mind, or should at least keep in mind, that when we try to correct one thing, we're going to have a big impact on something else, or perhaps several things. Okay, I've studied these things for many years, and it isn't easy. I think the plans should have some kind of justification and to go along with good intentions. Well, here's another one. Person asks, I heard the term nuclear family. What is it? We talk so much about nuclear things these days. Well, a nuclear family, it's the most common kind of family found in the world. The nuclear family, two adults of opposite sex living in a socially acceptable relationship with their own or adopted children. That's the definition of a nuclear family. And it doesn't address or define how many people in a family work, or any other conditions except those that just stated. So there are a lot of people who've come along and said the nuclear family is no longer present. Well, that's not true, because there's some people say, well, we have two worker families today, therefore the nuclear family is not present. No, that doesn't take away from the nuclear family definition. But it is a consistent definition, and it's the one that's used all over the world. It's found all over the world. Two adults of opposite sex. Has a lot to do with current legislation, some court cases, doesn't it? With their own or adopted children, okay? Two adults of opposite sex basically are a procreative unit. They're living in a socially acceptable relationship, and that is defined to mean what a society says it is. In other words, in some societies, that has to be a religious ceremony. In others, it can be a religious or civil. But whatever it is, it has to be socially accepted and recognized. And so, that's what it is. Well, here's another one. About the difference between men and women is men speak of love and have sex in mind, and women speak of sex and have love in mind. Is that true? Well, that used to be a pretty clear statement several years ago that represented a general pattern. It's true, but it's too simple. That doesn't cover everything. Generally, the differences in men and women, that is a broad statement. It used to be about 40 years ago now, a big study was made in the state of Florida, and it was found that unmarried female typically would have sex only with the person that she genuinely cared for. That wasn't true at the same time about the unmarried male. He tended to want to save his the best girlfriend, or the one he planned to marry, and not have sex with her, and the opposite was true of the women. Of course, that created a lot of problems. These things are changing today, but also about the same time, Ira Reese, a family sociologist, very well recognized for many years as a specialist, he came up and said there were 4 sex standards, basically. One was no sex, abstinent. One was sex with affection, one was sex without affection, and one was a double standard. What we're seeing today is sliding from sex with affection, in other words, people have to care about each other, over to sex without affection, and a decrease in the double standard. Double standard's still there, but it's certainly not as prominent as it used to be. In other words, men had one standard and women had another one, and society judged them accordingly. Women have been making a very real effort, the women's movement, trying to push women so that there is no double standard, there's only one standard. Whether or not that's good, bad, or indifferent, sort of old-fashioned, but I kind of like some things that are old-fashioned. Here's another one. It says, I recently read an article advising children to forgive their parents. That struck me as strange, and that came up. Forgive them. See, that implies, and I went over and read the article subsequently, but what was implied is that the parents are guilty for not providing their children with something, the very best, or if they didn't do it, then they're guilty of some kind of implied abuse or neglect. I think that's a little overboard. Sure, there are some parents who are scoundrels. There are some parents who, as the old expression used to be where I grew up, they weren't worth shooting. But that's not true. Most parents are okay. Most parents are all right. And if you don't have the parents you did have, you wouldn't be here. I think we ought to be a little on the other side. I think we ought to be counting our blessings more and thanking our parents for life, for taking care of us when we were young. And sure, it's been known for no telling how many thousands of years that when children grow up and they get to see the world a different perspective, they get to see that their parents so often are not perfect people. I don't know who is perfect. Maybe somebody in the viewing audience, so to speak, is perfect. Please come forward. I haven't met anybody yet. I used to think I was, but then I guess I grew up a little bit, found out I had all kinds of problems too. Maybe we ought to count our blessings more, seriously, and give some kind of gratitude expressions to the parents. Because most of them try to do a good job. Most of them have the best interest of the children at heart, and that's their intention. That they're well informed, some are, some aren't. But I've seen some of the best parents who couldn't spell the word. I've seen beautiful mothers who couldn't spell mother in any language. And I imagine that most of you have. Being a parent is a full-time job for most people. Well, here's another one. It says, my 15-year-old daughter rejected and became angry at my plan for her activities. Made out a schedule, and she just tore it up. What can I do? Well, what do you want to do? Are you intending for her to follow a pattern that's some kind of corrective pattern, or you want her to stay out of trouble, or what is it really that you're after? I would suggest, just by the tone of the question, that you ask the daughter to make up her own schedule and go over it with her. See what she puts down. Have the same intentions in mind. Now, if you're like most of us, and particularly a 15-year-old, you want to take charge of your life. Now, whether or not you're legally able to, you've been wanting to take charge of your life for a long time, by the time you reach age 15. Everybody wants to be the locus of control and have some say, if not all the say. And then most 15-year-olds are glad that they don't have the responsibility that goes with it. But give her a chance. Ask her to do her own schedule and go over it with you. See how you can improve on it. If you can't find yourself doing that, then ask her if she would go over your schedule and there be an agreement on the schedule of activities before you put it into effect. At that age, children need to be listened to, but you still have the veto power. You still have the responsibility, but you should certainly have their input. A good manager has input. And too often parents forget that. They come down a little bit hard. And I say too often. Some parents are that way. And we also have the problem the other way. Sometimes parents are the opposite. They don't want to have any responsibility. They want to give all the decision making to teenagers and say, well, it was your decision. In other words, the parents sometimes just plain cop out. And that is, I think, equally bad. So there has to be a balance there. Well, let's look at another one. It says, what do you think about the proposal to teach honesty and fairness, dependability in schools? I was in the media lately. This strikes me as odd. Yes, I've read some articles about that. And somebody asked me about it. What did I think about this, introducing that in schools? Frankly, I thought that was already in the schools. I thought most schools would teach that. Most schools would frown on cheating, talk about honesty. I thought most schools had policies about stealing other students' things off from the teacher. I thought most schools set deadlines. Your papers are due, or your project is due, or something else is due. Your homework is due at a certain time, which gets into dependability. I thought schools were already teaching that. Now, maybe they've slacked off so much that it needs to be reintroduced. And I'm not at all opposed to the Big Ten being posted in all the classrooms. I think it's a simple statement. The Ten Commandments. Universal rules. Basically, all societies have something like it, if not the Ten Commandments themselves. And I think children need to be reminded that these things are important. A rule of 10, set of 10 rules, that's really how we can get along better with everybody. Society can get along better with itself. That's my understanding of why the Ten Commandments came into being. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. What we have to start with about question came up about politically correct language in schools. Party was asking my opinion of it, and for the most part, I think it's junk. Simple put. And somebody may not even know what junk is these days. But it's like learning a new language, argot, a dialect. Just learn to speak a certain way. But what I've found about politically correct language, oftentimes it does not seem to improve the understanding. It doesn't seem to go in depth to really get at a more precise meaning. I think for that reason that most of it is not particularly useful, and it's a hindrance. I know it's an encumbrance to read the double pronouns, and so people have gotten away from double pronouns. And instead of saying he or she, it used to be correct to say only a generic pronoun, which is okay. I never objected if somebody wanted to use the generic pronoun she instead of the generic pronoun he, but I object to having a plural subject with a singular verb, or the other way around. Poor grammar. Grammar? English? Okay, it's being changed. But that was the answer to the question. Excuse me. Here's another one. It says, what's my opinion the difference between self-esteem and self-concept? I recall speaking about this before, but people come up with a question again. And self-concept is your image, your picture of yourself, as you see yourself. I've sometimes said I'm old, fat, and ugly. That's my self-concept, but that doesn't tell you what I think of myself, how I value myself. That would be my self-esteem, how I esteem myself. I think they're very useful to keep them separate. I'm well aware that in many books and articles and so on, these two things are treated as if they're the same. I don't think they are. And I think it's useful to keep in mind that we can know, for example, a handicapped. I was just reading, it makes me think of it. I think his name is Michael. Is that it? The kid without any, was born without arms, who plays the guitar. with his feet. Now his self-concept is that he's a handicapped person. But his esteem, to listen to his own story, is just remarkable. He considers himself a very valuable person in helping youth and getting youth to consider and become a better person in society. Well, here's another question. Someone said, I hear that child abuse is everywhere. Child abuse everywhere. Is it true? No. I can't say that is true. I think it's so popular these days because of the way it's being defined. If you get the legal definitions of what abuse is, it's very broad, much broader than it used to be thought of. No, but there are several conditions. For example, a single parent, the child of a single parent is 2.5 times more likely to be abused. A child on welfare in a welfare family is 4 times more likely to be abused than the families that aren't. If the parents are regular church attenders, well, they're about half as likely to be abused as children of parents who do not attend church regularly. So what we're looking at, and this is from some very broad studies, by the way, and one of them, a study here from upstate New York, done by a group out of Columbia University, basically finding these things, that this is where you find abuse, as it's being defined. Now, so the advice is to children, the next time you're born, be sure to pick your parents a little more carefully. Pick parents who will stick to you, stick by you, who will keep their marriage intact, who stay off welfare and go to church regularly. Those make for non-abusing families. And I hope you know I don't really believe reincarnation. That was a joke. Here's a question that says, does a law requiring parental notification for minors wanting an abortion, does it really have an impact? Does it really have an effect? A lot of people have thought seriously about that sort of thing. Some people are very much in favor of, if a minor girl wants to have an abortion, that the parents be notified. Because it gets into the parental responsibility. The way this is practiced today, you find that even schools get involved with it in usurping parental responsibility and authority by making arrangements themselves. I have known of health teachers and school nurses, people like that, actually arranging these things and arranging a transport of a child from one place to another one for the purpose of abortion, have them back in school. They ride the school bus home and the parents never know anything about it. There was a study done at Wheaton College on this, and they took teenagers, 15, 16-year-olds, who, under the law, would have to have parental notification. And they compared them to 18 and 19-year-olds with the assumption that if the 18 and 19-year-olds who were not covered, their parents did not have to be notified, would there still be a decrease or an impact on whether or not they had abortions? And what they found in this study at Wheaton College was yes. Parental notification laws, when they're enforced, have a significant impact, not only with minors, but on those girls who no longer would have had to have parental notification. So there was a decrease in abortions in both age groups. I think that's rather interesting. Well, Somewhat like that in the context there, the next question says, has there been a breakdown in all the barriers for teenagers having non-marital or premarital sex? The question is a little broad. All barriers? No. The same reasons for abstaining and not having premarital sex has been found present today as was found 50, 60, 70 years ago. They're not as strong, but they're there. And there's always a group of young people who do not choose to have premarital sex. A group of people who choose to wait until marriage. And, that number has decreased only very slightly, the number of young people in that age group. Basically, the fear of pregnancy, the religious restrictions that a person belongs to, the fear of not having a good relationship and having only temporary relationships, these things come out to be present today as the reasons people give for not getting into sex. And somebody comes along with, the availability of contraception. I think anybody in their right mind knows that contraceptions are readily available in schools, anywhere else. That is not a factor. That's part of the propaganda, but in my opinion, it's not a factor anymore. I remember doing a study at Plattsburgh State, and the study was worded in such a way that that people were really, I think, asked to be honest about their statements. And these were anonymous. These were done anonymously, but in a very controlled, scientifically controlled way. It was found basically with the questions that have you up to this time had non-marital sex. And it was involved so that it was specific, because some people don't define sex, as we heard with the Monica case, that some people define sex some ways and some define it another way. So it was a question that included genital intercourse. Have you up to this time had premarital genital intercourse? And how about your roommate? How about other people you know? People were asked to give percentages and estimates. Well, here's what it came out. And this was a rather large-scale study, as studies go, several years ago. But the number of college freshmen who had not had premarital genital intercourse was pretty good size, not like the propaganda, not like the media would have. They were classified according to the level and a year in college. Yes, it kept going down. But there were always, and there was a consistent number of seniors, 4 years in college, 4 years out of the parents' home and all that sort of thing, who maintained a celibate life, who maintained an abstinence standard. And it was quite clear. This is what I found in my own studies. The literature at the time was very much argumentative. I reported on that to several different groups, and most people were glad to hear it, but most people were a little afraid to try to go back to their own classrooms and teach that there are people in the classroom who are not having sex, in spite of everybody's idea that they were. Well, here's a study, though, and they come up with another subject. Study that asks a question today. Think about it. Are full-time women who are working full-time out of the home, are they getting to be more of the average, the norm, compared to the stay-at-home mothers? And are stay-at-home mothers being penalized in the sense that they don't have any other women now, or like they used to have their coffee clutches with, And their children are even more isolated because the children of the women who work out of the home are in some kind of alternate care situation. But what about the satisfaction of these people with their work and the balance between families? A very recent study in Canada, rather large scale, but just right across the border, not our border right here, this was over in western Canada. Here's what was found. That the women who work full-time out of the home were not as satisfied as the women who were stay-at-home. The women who work part-time, that is 20 hours or less per week, were more satisfied with the balance than the people who work full-time, but they were not as satisfied by their own statements as the women who didn't work at all. Now, there was a difference also in the men's ratings. It's been found before that the men of full-time working wives were not happy. They were happier with part-time working wives and happiest with the stay-at-home wives, except men do like that extra income, I guess, for toys. When you really go around and you find out what most women work for, they work for extras. I've heard them say it over and over again. Well, we buy the extras with my income. They have it set up and they've arranged it so that basically the essentials come out of the husband's income and the other things come out of the wife's income. That's okay. People will do it that way. However, how about the satisfaction? The life satisfaction. That's what the study was reaching for. Well, it turns out that people are more satisfied. The women themselves are more satisfied when they are not working out of the home, particularly with small children. So the question comes up, why don't people structure their lives in a better way so that they can do it? Well, here's another question. Is there an increase in burnout today? Burnout. Yes, there's an increase, but it's interesting, I think, because we used to call it getting tired, fatigued. Nowadays, people burn out, and they use that expression pretty openly, so yes, there's an increase in the term. But I found burnout to be most of the time when people are in conflict between what they're doing and what they think they should do or what they think they shouldn't be doing. I usually find that's involved in burnout. Very few people just really work too much. Not much reason to do that in today's society. But if they're doing something that's in conflict, I think that sort of short circuits, and that's what causes a burnout. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. And to start with, we have a rather interesting question. At least I think it's interesting. And I hope you do too. The question is, Party was saying, I was told that some children can't learn with a dialectical approach. Is it true? Well, first the answer is yes. That's the general answer. But secondly, I don't have a clear idea of what the party meant by dialectical. It could mean several different things. First, the dictionary definition about dialectics is a definition of a word and then redefining the word and trying to find all of the meanings that go with that particular word. That's one use of the word dialectical. So you can think of a child being taught that way. Well, a very small child's not going to learn much that way. So the answer could be simple, yes, that's true. Children don't learn well that way. But there's another use of the word dialectical. The dialectical approach is to take a position, take a definition, and then take the opposite, and then to try to reconcile the differences, find a resolution. This, by the way, was part of the humanistic educational pattern, the use of dialectical approach. Frederick Engels, he was a philosopher. Karl Marx borrowed it from Engels. Engels was his supporting partner. And he used it dialectical historicism. They used it in history. And dialectics can also be summarized this way. You take a thesis, you take a position, then you take the opposite, the antithesis, and then you take a thesis from those differences. If that sounds a little bit confusing, it is to children. But oftentimes, I have seen it in classrooms. I hope it's not going on as much now as I used to see it. We've all seen children who could tear up something but couldn't put it back together again. If you haven't done that yourself, well, you ought to try it sometime. There's still clocks that I haven't put back together. I could take apart, but I couldn't put them back together. Haven't been able to yet. Maybe I will. The idea of here, if you take a social condition and then you tell the children that that's not right, that the opposite can be right, and the expectation is the children will benefit when they put it back together. There's one problem with it. Children, before they reach the age where they can use abstract reasoning, can't do that. They're not good at resynthesis. They're not good at synthesizing part-whole relationships. They're just being a child. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the child, the way the child is thinking. But at specific ages, it's been found that they're not good at it. And it can be more confusing. And so the answer, if you haven't quit on me already, the answer is I certainly don't recommend it. So let's get out of that question while we're still alive. Huh? Okay. Have you ever worked with dying? And if so, what are the differences? Yes, I have worked with some dying patients, and I was always surprised when I first started because their concerns are pretty much like other people's concerns. Quite a few years ago, when I first started doing that, I didn't expect people who were dying to have ordinary concerns. I expected them to have something extraordinary. But I found that most of the people I worked with were concerned about deeds not finished, things they haven't completed, about their relationship, particularly with children, with other people, relationships which they were feeling were not as fulfilled as they wanted them to be. But most of the people seemed to want somebody who genuinely cared to listen to them, to let them share. Somebody who has creative listening. Of course, all of us like that. We don't have to be dying. Of course, all of us are dying by degrees, I suppose. But we don't have to be dying to want somebody to listen to us very carefully and in a creative way. That's what I found with people who are dying. Yes, they wanted to share some things. I've had people who expressed a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow, but most of the time over things they hadn't done with their next of kin, their children. But ordinary people are concerned about ordinary things. Well, here's another question. It says, what's the best birth control that is over 95% effective that you know of? The question struck me as odd, coming out of the dark, as much information is handed out today on birth control. But I think the answer is pretty simple. Of course, abstinence, surgery, the oral pill, and natural family planning are all over 95% effective. 100% effective is abstaining. Even surgery has its problems. I had 2 women in a row one time in counseling who'd had tubal ligations, and both of them were pregnant. It was the same physician. who had performed the tubal ligation, just happenstance, I guess. But sometimes the body wants to rechannel, and will do things like that. The oral pill is highly valued by most people as so effective, but it rates right along with natural family planning if it's done correctly, just like taking a pill. If you don't take it correctly, it loses effectiveness too. But I used to teach this sort of thing in family life courses. It always puzzled me in college. I never taught family life courses in high school, but always in college and university. What puzzled me was that the students didn't seem to remember. They could remember all kinds of other things, but to give them an actual series of test questions on effectiveness in family planning, they seem for some reason to have a lot of trouble with that. I never did understand why. Well, here's another question. It says, if someone who's had an annulment based on a defect in the person, can that person get married again? Well, if you're really serious, to answer the question, go talk to the parish priest, the pastor. But in general, the answer is it's possible. It depends. Has the defect been corrected? So the tribunal, the court that rules on annulments, can give an annulment, grant an annulment, that is, a decree of nullity, saying the marriage did not take place because it could not have taken place because of whatever condition it found or circumstance, and can put an addendum on that, fancy terms, but they can put another statement that says the person will not be permitted to enter the matrimonial state until it is documented that that condition or whatever the circumstances were is no longer present. So, answer the question, yes, it's possible. But anybody who's serious about it, and it is very serious and it gets to be a deep question, go talk it over with a pastor. Well, here's another question, a little easier to answer. It says, what's wrong with marriages today? Nothing. I haven't found anything wrong with marriages. I find a lot of things wrong with some of the people who get married, such as lack of commitment, fear of responsibility, not having had a model in their own homes, not knowing what love is or how to handle love. I hear these things, I see these things, but candidly, I don't know of anything wrong with marriage. Probably some of you come up and tell me something like that. Well, here's another one. Says, what's the origin of peer pressure? We hear so much about peer pressure today. The party who asked says, how does it get started? It was a thoughtful person, thoughtful question. Well, I think basically it's an instinct. All of us want to be part of a group. We have a herd instinct, gregariousness. All mammals are considered gregarious, a characteristic of a mammal. We want to be in a group, and it's instinctive. It serves a purpose of protection. Anything outside of the group is likely to be the object of a predator. Not live very long. Stay with the group for survival. And then what happens is, then when people are comfortable being in the group, what happens? Well, they want to be a little different from the group in order to get recognition, but that's another level. So I think peer pressure first is instinctive. People want to be a part of a group. And the family chooses the peers. For most kids, and they don't like to admit it, but they do, they pick the neighborhoods, the houses where people live. It's the choice of the parents, usually not the children. The schools they go to, the churches they belong to, where the peers come from. That's where the peers come from, so the parents have picked them. Then they wonder why the peers have so much influence. Well, the peers are having more influence because the family is not having as much influence. But families that are close, tight as they say, those families have more influence than the peers. But perhaps all of you have seen these experiments and done them. I've done them a number of times. I've been involved with them when I first heard about it and was astounded how much people want to be like the group. They don't want to be different. Even to making simple judgments. They'll change their judgments to fit in the group. And that's part of peer pressure. So, the clothing, the language, sure. They want to fit in the group, and then they have to change to be different from the group to get recognition. Well, here's another one. It says, why can't the people who take care of children be taught to pick out the ones who are going to give problems so that it can be fair to the other children? Well, here's a problem with that. Most of us have much better hindsight than we have foresight. This has been studied for quite a few years, and it used to be almost impossible to have any real reliability on predicting outcomes. Now, with fancy genetic research, we may be much closer to doing that sort of thing. But typical behavior, put it this way, most of the time people haven't read the book, so they don't know how they're supposed to act. And so they have the freedom to act. We got into trouble years ago when this was going on. We got into trouble by making retrospective analysis and trying to make it projective analysis. In other words, we'd take a group of people who had certain characteristics in common and try to figure out how people with those characteristics would act in the future and make projections. Very, very unreliable. I remember the most serious kind of thing was with German measles and what all it could cause. Because most people who were in institutions who were mentally retarded related to German measles. It was thought then that German measles had a very high likelihood of causing retardation. Well, it turned out that wasn't the case. Well, here's another one. It says, is it true that body parts like arms and eyes, kidneys are being sold? Kind of a grisly question, isn't it? It's illegal to sell body parts. There's a law against it. But here's what is being sold. What's being sold and what's being marketed is that people can pay a fee for processing. I have a purchase order here, a list of body parts and how much it costs to process them. And it's, I haven't counted them, it looks like maybe 20, 25 different parts of the body. Processed for a certain fee. It's illegal to pay for the body part, but it's legal to pay the fee for services. And this is out of a company in West Frankfort, Illinois. Address and phone number, everything's here. These body parts, and this are coming from unborn children, fetal body parts. Laboratories want to use them, study them, that sort of thing. There's strange and a great amount of interest in this sort of thing today. But people don't want to look at it. People don't want to admit it. That body parts are for sale on the market and with even a stipulated fee. And what happens is the company that's doing this marketing in some places will send in its people into the abortion clinics to do the processing. So the abortion clinic can say, well, we don't sell that sort of thing. We're not in that business. But it's a very gross kind of thing to think about. Think about what you want in your society. I'll think about what I want in mine. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. Family Life in the North Country. Have a good day.